The 1960s were one of the most exciting times in fashion history. A vast range of styles reflected the social times and creative expression of the decade. As costume designer for the Emmy Award-winning show Mad Men, I've only touched the tip of the iceberg on the style, aesthetic, and look of the 1960s clothing. Join me on a journey through the fashion history of the 1960s. Seasons 1 and 2 of Mad Men fall into the classic fashion style of the late 1950s and early 60s. Gray flannel suits were a staple of men's wardrobes, while women flaunted the classic bouffant look. I especially enjoyed designing this period. It was feminine, suave, and elegant.
The rise of the Cold War led to a fearful atmosphere in America. And at the same time, you had a booming economy. So the result for fashion was a look that was conservative, but also highly consumerist.
It represents a time where optimism was high and anything could be accomplished.
What you get from the 50s is a real feminine shape. A really pronounced waist, you get a full skirt or a straight skirt, and you really get like a nice, delicate shoulder. Really, that early 60s period is so key to what I see as a feminine look.
Christian Dior was the most important designer of the middle of the century. In 1947, he launched the New Look, which brought in opulent, luxurious femininity after World War II. Cinched waist, voluptuous bosom, long skirt, totally feminine.
The early 60s style never gets tired. And no matter what goes on in fashion, a woman wearing a dress that's fitted on the top and fuller on the bottom, it doesn't get tired. It just means you're timeless and you're chic. It's Grace Kelly, it's Audrey Hepburn, it's Catherine Deneuve. This is what we never get sick of seeing.
Wife dressing is a term invented by the fashion designer Anne Fogarty. The first principle of wife dressing was complete femininity. A woman should be dressing to please her husband and to help him in his career. So she should always wear a girdle, always be dressing in a way to help and please her husband. This was part of the conservative sexual politics of the 1950s and early 60s. It was really an era of the feminine mystique and going back to strict gender rules. So women were supposed to dress like women and men were supposed to be like men.
Men's fashion previous to the 60s was really about the man in the gray flannel suit, the sort of legendary 50s kind of character. Every man had a suit, a fedora, you were done.
Suiting meant one thing and one thing only, business. In order to be taken seriously, you wore a suit. That still holds true today.
The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit was initially the title of a novel about a World War II veteran, and then it was made into a movie in 1956 with Gregory Peck. The idea was he was the establishment man, the organization man, who wore this suit to fit into his role as sort of a conformist, hardworking cog in the machine.
The quintessential cut was the 3-button and a 2.5-inch lapel. Most of the shirts in the 60s, white was the uniform. When you had a well-made suit, you had a full leg and a cuffed, you needed a substantial shoe at the bottom of that. So that's where the brogues come in. That was, quite frankly, part of the uniform.
We think of it as just a total stereotype. The man in the gray flannel suit was a suit. He was a stiff, just part of the machine.
Before Kennedy's inauguration, another big part of the uniform were hats. Kennedy single-handedly killed the hat. When Kennedy stood up at his inauguration, he took his hat off and put it on his chair. And in doing so, basically told the nation, I'm not wearing a hat to the most important part of my life. From that day forward, hat sales declined.
Jackie Kennedy, in and of herself, is probably the #1 icon of the 60s to anyone.
Jackie Kennedy was the classic upper-class East Coast ideal. So she was very ladylike, she was an equestrian, rode horseback, and she was always very dressed up in that kind of proper Parisian style of fashion.
She was originally shopping in Europe and in France, but had to start dressing American when she was the First Lady.
When she became the wife of Jack Kennedy and he was running for president, then she was told she couldn't buy French clothes anymore. So this was a catastrophe. And she found Oleg Cassini to make her simple little shift dresses, suits, always wearing gloves, always wearing a hat.
The pillbox hats, it was his first big moment to do that pillbox hat. It was the first time we saw a fashion designer take that sort of almost military inspiration in that hat and make it a fashion statement. She wore color so beautifully. Her hair was flawless. She wore amazing jewelry, but not too much. I think any woman just looked at her and said, I want to wear that. I want to be her. I want to look like her.
What she really brought to the world was a much more streamlined look. Really very modern, just symbolic of ushering in a new era.
A huge influence on fashion that drastically changed the look, shape, and feel of clothing worn during the mid-60s was the mod look. Suddenly, outrageous fabrics and prints dominated the runways. Women were showing lots of leg, and the men in the gray flannel suits were now sporting funky colored textiles. It was all about looking modern, young, and hip.
The first really big modern youthquake movement came out of England, and it was associated with music groups like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Who. It involved brilliant colors, bold patterns, men having longer hair.
Originally, the mods were sort of a youth gang in a way, and then it became co-opted into a fashion trend. But it was really based on a youthful style, wanting to look like a young girl. It would be very short skirts, very childlike hair, different colored tights. It could be flat shoes or flat boots. And then to counterbalance that very childish quality of the clothing, women would wear a lot of eye makeup to show, okay, we're grown up, but we can still dress like little girls.
It was a lot about black and white, bold prints if you were going to do a print. And jewelry was usually graphic and slightly oversized.
You know, we started to see the high, like white patent boots and orange patent coats with these high collars and super short minis and just lots of leg everywhere.
The 60s was really the time when boots were not just galoshes to wear in the rain, but started to be used as a piece of fashion clothing. Funny thing about the tights and the boots and the miniskirts is that it was generally thought that women's knees were ugly. And nobody wanted to show their knees. And when the miniskirts first came out on the market everywhere was knee makeup just to make your knees look better.
Mary Quant was really revolutionary in bringing about the miniskirt, and the knee hadn't really been seen since the 20s, and even then it was hovering around the knee. This was again really a reflection of what was going on in society, a freeing of the mind, a freeing of what you're wearing too.
The interesting thing about the miniskirt, it was much more of a statement. In the 50s, the idea was, oh, if you show too much, men might not be able to control themselves. And in the 60s, it was sort of taking their power into their own hands and saying, you know what, I'm strong enough to present myself in a sexual way and to decide, yes, I want to, or no, I don't, but the power is mine and it's my decision, as opposed to hiding because somebody else might make that decision for you.
The women were in their minis and their patent knee-high boots and big glasses, and the men were wearing the skinny ties and skinny lapels and clothes that looked like they were 5 sizes too small. The men play off the women, and the designers, whatever they're doing for women, they're gonna have the men sort of be cohesive with what's happening with the women.
Men's clothing gradually became sleeker and more modernized in the period between 1960 and 1965. Combination of influences from Italian fashion, British mod fashion, and even French designers like Pierre Cardin. Pierre Cardin's probably most famous for introducing the Nehru jacket and also for putting the Beatles in matching mod-looking suits. He was the person who helped modernize menswear. took away collars and cuffs and pants, instead single-breasted, narrow jackets, narrow trousers, maybe no collar at all, definitely minimal in mod.
With the mod influences or the influences from across the pond or Italian fashioning, you start seeing the slimmer silhouettes and lower profile suiting.
Gucci, Pucci, Pierre Cardin, Jeffrey Bean, Mary Quant, Christian Dior, Yves Saint Laurent. We just look to them all the time to inspire us and set the trends.
Yves Saint Laurent was young, and he was the only designer who was able to bridge this gap between youthquake street style and French haute couture. So as you can imagine, he was hugely successful and influential. He made clothes that were hip and young, but they weren't so extreme that an older couture customer couldn't wear them. They helped make people look young.
The Mondrian dress was really a watershed moment in fashion because it was really the collision of art and fashion together.
Yves Saint Laurent was the first one to say, literally, he's taking a painting and those techniques of color blocking and literally putting them onto a blank canvas of a shift dress. And it was this brilliant movement in fashion because it was the first time we saw the technique of literally not creating a pattern and putting it on a dress, but actually taking blocks of wool jersey and then hiding the seam work to make it look literally like a painting.
He was reflecting what was going on in the art world.
It was literally hand done and it was couture. It was genius.
Yves Saint Laurent contributed so much to the world of fashion. What he really did was break a lot of rules that we now take for granted. Yves Saint Laurent taking the pantsuit, or even more specifically, the smoking, which was really a men's tuxedo slimmed down for a woman, was scandalous because it was sort of subverting sexuality. You saw it in the 30s with Marlene Dietrich, Katharine Hepburn, but those were not the norm. He really brought it in for everybody.
Women were wearing pants before that, but they would not be allowed in restaurants for dinner. There's a famous story about a woman who went to the 21 Club and she was wearing a tunic top and a pantsuit, and they said, you know, you can't come to dinner. So she took off her pants and then walked into the dining room wearing her tunic as a micro mini. And after that, the restaurant said, okay, we're gonna relax and now you can wear pants here for dinner. But that was a big thing when Saint Laurent sent down the pants. It was said, okay, that's fashionable, it's okay, it's still dressy.
He took women out of, wearing dresses and hiding, and he said they can be androgynous, they can wear a tuxedo and be so sexy.
Fashion is always going to be a reflection of what's going on in the world. While in the early 60s, at least, it was more about specific hemlines and this is what you had to wear. The mid-60s, there's a little bit more individualism.
Bonnie Cashin was an American designer who'd previously done Hollywood and theater costumes, but who then moved into the idea of doing organic, comfortable clothes for smart, kind of bohemian people.
She was one of the most important, significant, pioneering women in American design. She's considered one of the originators of American sportswear.
Bonnie Cashin created the idea of sportswear dressing, different components that you could put together. She used really interesting fabrics, such as rustic tweeds, leathers, even industrial hardware. So she was able to take everyday, sort of more low fabrics and really treat them in a way that was appropriate for a high-end fashion customer.
Bonnie always functioned first and foremost as an artist. She would literally take these canvases that were bigger than life size, and she would draw out a sweater, and then she would paint the design onto that. So that was how she was designing them, literally as paintings. So you get these fantastic abstract art motifs that are on these sweaters, and it's because she treated them as if she was painting a canvas. She was really interested in using contemporary painting, African mud sculpture, incredible abstract art. She really designed first and foremost for herself and for women who were interested in the modern world, who were interested in contemporary life.
So lots of coats that were practical, that had pockets where you could carry a paperback book, and different fastenings that were sort of techno fashionings. As fashion got simpler in the 1960s, little cookie-cutter, simple dresses that young girls wore, the concept of paper dresses became really feasible.
Bonnie loved paper. In the 60s, she got more serious about paper as a medium unto itself, not just the utilitarian, but looking at this as another means of creative expression in fashion. So she started to look at tufted paper and woven paper and to figure out how these things could be used as sculptural materials, really, to create fashion that would last. She didn't like the idea of throwaway society, so she was constantly experimenting with different types of paper and how to use other materials in conjunction with that to create garments that would actually work. And as you can see behind me, there's a garment that has this beautiful gold collar, which is completely woven paper, and it is, to date, is 40 years old.
The things like paper dresses with Andy Warhol type Campbell soup prints on them, they were all part of this sort of high-low mix of pop art and popular fashion.
Social and political trends have always made a huge impact in the fashion world. The late 60s was a time of civil rights protests, women's liberation, and the Vietnam War. Many began to rebel. Hair grew longer, hemlines lengthened, and the hippie was born.
The second wave of youthquake was the hippie fashion revolution, and that starts around 1967, primarily in places like San Francisco, where the Summer of Love was very important.
I think with what was going on in the political environment, people just wanted to rebel. It was a time of rebellion, and it was sort of like, you know what? Let's switch from the sort of grooviness of the 60s to say, we want to wear nothing that shows our bodies and everything's going to hang off. We're going to be totally free-spirited and just have everything too big and shapeless, and our hair, we're not going to wash it.
The look moved from just being sort of the amphetamine-fueled look of the mods, very clean, fast, modern, to a hippie sense of looking at the clothing of long ago and far away.
What we started to see was that movement from the sort of cropped, very tailored, very kind of minimal color blocking to this like drapey, blouson arms and batwing sleeves.
A lot of the young people were rejecting the war and protesting it. With that came a rejection of the establishment, a rejection of commercialism. So we're going to go to the Salvation Army and buy these secondhand clothing and make it ourselves.
It was much more fantasy fashion, not about modernity, not about change, but rather about expressing yourself. You wanted to get away from the fashion system and to be much more personal. So it's the beginning of the me decade in fashion, all about pleasing yourself.
Men found a new freedom in terms of how they were dressing. Before, they were very buttoned up. With the Beatles, they saw people can be all these different things, and it's not just the man who goes to work 9 to 5 and that sort of dressing, but they could wear the Nehru jackets, they could wear floral shirts and crazy prints. And it was also a bit of a feminization that they were allowed to have in their clothing. Blousey sleeves, tighter pants. It was just a whole embracing of new ideas and new ways to look at how people dress.
The men were wearing bell-bottoms and vests, but they were still in very fitted shirts and things that looked too small and looked like they took them out of their laundry bag, and, you know, but that's what it was.
With the hippies, it was like, you know what, if I don't want to look sexy, I don't have to. I can just wear whatever I want to. What's more important in the world is peace. With people using psychedelics, I think that created a lot of demand for the bright colors, the wild patterns.
As we got into the late 60s, we started to get this kind of, you know, patterns from florals and paisleys and stripes and, you know, chevron prints and things like that.
The embrace of the ethnic styles in the 1960s came in the later part of the 60s. The Beatles were going to India and learning about the religions there and being influenced by what they saw. There was a rejection of Western culture and embracing of the East.
A lot of people were traveling to Morocco, to India, and they're bringing back these clothes, not just in the old sensibility of, oh, we can appropriate all these styles, but in a more interested and empathetic approach to the fashions of other parts of the world. It was the beginning of using fashion really to express identity politics.
I think the style of the 60s will be here forever because, again, you start out from the early years of the 60s with the very 50s kind of look all the way up to 1969 where you have a completely different look. So within that 10 years, you have a world of fashion.
I think these designers sort of set the bar.
60s styles are reborn in fashion trends because designers see it as a way to look modern.
And I think that's when you say a period in fashion is so essential. It's when you look 40 years later and women are still doing it.